fellow priest Portia Jefferson, Monique La Reina, Tosi Long, my godchildren, Barrina Rowland and Shaka, and a number of people who I see here. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, I can't speak another word without acknowledging a couple of people, some elders who honored and rewarded me with their words by writing the preface and the postface to my book. And that is a student of Sheikh Anta Diop, the incomparable Dr. Iva Carruthers of the Samuel Proctor Foundation, and my partner, the Supreme Chief of Voodoo Wedo, who also is an incredible oral historian, His Majesty Dada Dagbo Huna Huna II Wele Abemi. Now, I'm sure if you are wondering what's behind me. You see it? Those are breathing holes. They're in the floors of the first African Baptist church in Savannah, Georgia. It's one of the last places I visited in my trips last year. And in the middle of the night, Spirit told me, this is the image I must have behind me in honor of not only George Floyd, but all of us who struggle to breathe in this space, in this country, and elsewhere at this point in time. These breathing holes were used for the Africans who were part of the Underground Railroad. They were hidden there beneath the floorboards. And so those holes planted in the floors, created in the floors, were to allow them to breathe. So there's an enormously spiritual component to this as well. And my book, Redlining a Holocaust, Memorials and the People of the AfroAtlantic, is the mother of my first book, Good Kase Good, Conjuring Memory in Spaces of the Afro-Atlantic. And both books are dedicated to the International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015-2024. The works came from my life experiences, the places I lived in, the places I visited, the monuments, the memorials, the historic sites of the Ma'afa. I use the word Ma'afa because we're looking at what most of you know as the transatlantic slave trade in captive Africans. We're looking at this from the perspective of those of us who endured that great suffering, that horrible experience. So I choose to use the word Ma'afa instead of transatlantic slave trade. This book comes from people I have met. And in a second, Tracy will show you some of the people that I worked with. And it focuses on the battles that we fought and that we continue to fight in. We've been engaged in since 2001. Myself and a number of people I talk about in the book, Redlining a Holocaust, specifically the International Movement for Reparations, or the Mouvement International pour la Réparation, MIR, based in Martinique, and in France, the Collectif de 10 Mai, who hosts the Marche des Esclaves. Myself and they, and many, many, many others have been organizing international demonstrations. We've been formulating public policy, producing art, and generating scholarly and public education programs geared towards eliminating racism and bias. We can go back to me on the screen, please. Now, quiet as it's kept, we've been doing this work for many years. And we've been doing this through the 2001 World Conference Against Racism that took place in Durban, South Africa. And out of that conference came a really important document called the Durban Declaration and Program of Action Plan, the DDPA. The DDPA is an international moral mandate that calls for an end to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. It declared the transatlantic slave trade, or the Ma'afa, a crime against humanity that should have never occurred. And in so doing, it opened the courthouse doors for African descendants to pursue reparations. Now, most of you don't know about the DDPA because it is the social contract that the UN member states, including the United States, big surprise, right, didn't seem to care about, at least not for the regular reasons. They didn't want to sign on to it. And in my book, I focus on the DDPA as the core of the contemporary human rights movement, not only because it is, and I say this with all due respect to Black Lives Matter, but the DDPA is one of those central documents. It is a critical element in our history that our governments attempted to redline, to make that knowledge inaccessible. That is our inalienable rights to human rights, to restitutions, apologies, and compensation for the wrongs inflicted on African descendants. And in the second section of my book, The Right to Memory and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action Plan, I talk extensively about that, and you can learn about that there, and I really do encourage you to do so. So having said that, I bring up the word redlining, you know a little bit about what I mean and why the title of the book, Redlining a Holocaust, is what it is. Because like access to bank loans, certain types of insurance, specific neighborhoods and properties, knowledge and information pertinent to defining the self, you know, to understanding our history and the kind of agency that it provides, that too is something that has been redlined. That too is something that we have not had ready access to. Now, what does wash, kase, wash mean? That's the subtitle of the book. Well, it's part of a Haitian expression. Wash, kase, wash, good, kase, good. A wash is a rock, right? And rocks were everywhere in my journey, everywhere. Some of them were rough and they were made smooth over time. Some made me so proud to see them, to touch them, to even smell them. Others, they shocked me and they offended my sensibilities. And ultimately, the rocks led me back to the water, right? Which is, of course, how we as Africans arrived in the Americas. And we're going to take a look at those as well. The subtitle of the book, Wash, Kase, Wash, again, is a Haitian expression. And while it does translate into rocks break rocks, and some of you can think of it as fight fire with fire, it is also a way of stating break the silence, break the silence. And the current social unrest tipped over by the murders of Floyd, Avery, Taylor, and the countless men and women who are the victims of police brutality, structural racism, and the menacing realities that we live day in, day out as African descendants, it makes the book's title a call to action. It's a call for action, you know. And while I was writing this, the specters of Trayvon Martin and Eric Gardner were the two spirits who haunted me as I was finishing up my book. And so now if I were to update it tomorrow, I would just add more names, and that breaks my heart. So I want to also note that the notion of the kase, it isn't just a break. It doesn't mean just to annul something, as in, you know, breaking the silence of history. But a kase is also a musical reference and a spiritual one. And the kase is that place, you know, where the music is sounding real good, right? And it hits us just right, and we fall into the place. We fall into what's called the groove, for those of you who are too young to know what that is, but it is the groove, right? Where we're feeling real good. And in that space of goodness, what do we have? We create community with one another, right? And it's a place of solidarity and understanding. And it is a place that we create for ourselves. And so that's also part of what I want people to understand as we read the book. Other elements of the title, memorials and the people of the AfroAtlantic, well, that's pretty straightforward, right? My book, of course, analyzes public spaces and historic sites and what's happening in the news, what's going on in our communities. We witness monuments being destroyed, such as the now questionable historic abolitionist Victor Schlocher in Martinique. Before things popped off here in the United States, they were tearing things down. They were tearing it up in Martinique, right? We have the toppled statue of the slave trader, Edward Colston, who was symbolically drowned in the waters of the port city of Bristol. The graffitied bronze and now removed likeliness of that savage king, King Leopold, in Antwerp, Brussels. And now we're also seeing the ongoing dismantlement of Confederate monuments all around the United States. So creating the importance of creating civil monuments for African descendants as part of the reparatory justice that we seek, you know, this is a process that I talk about in depth in my book. And while chapters of my book unpacked the multiple historic causes for the tensions that we are witnessing, including the failure of the more powerful UN member states to adhere to that vital, you know, human rights mandate, again, the DDPA. It was intended to eliminate racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. And I cannot underscore enough how important the DDPA is and why I was a part of that movement, why the numerous NGOs and activists were a part of the movement, because at this point in time, I can't help but wonder that if this country had signed on to the DDPA and had it sought universal adherence of the DDPA among its fellow member states, that we wouldn't have all these deaths. We wouldn't have all these deaths, that we would not have paid over $55 million in wrongful death suits. You know, it's a calculation that I made of some 68 murders of unarmed African descendant children, women, men that occurred between 1999 and 2016. 55,513,697,000 specifically, all right? And the numbers of African descendants who have been killed by police in Europe and now in China, not just by police, but also who are victims of hate crime, we don't know. We don't know because that data hasn't been aggregated yet. Anyway, these deaths, they do have an adverse effect, as you know, not just on the individuals, not just on their families and the communities, but also on the state itself. And I'm just going to read a brief passage in my book about that. And it says, states run the risk of diminishing their capacity for not recognizing the extent of its human capital. The development of any human being is psychological, moral, ethical, intellectual, spiritual, material, and spatial. Human rights are intrinsically linked to human development, and our memorials are relevant reminders of that reality. Denying memory leads to a loss of human assets. It provides one group with a sense of moral superiority and imbibes another with complexes of inferiority. Refusal to acknowledge the epic nature of our tragedy, and again, I'm talking about the Ma'afa, means that no meaningful apologies are possible. And without apologies, there can be no reconciliation. Without reconciliation, no remedies can be made to correct injustices. As long as injustices remain in societies, antagonisms, non-conviviality, disparities, and inequalities will prevail. Now, while the book is about the history of enslavement and contemporary social history and monuments, it's also about my personal geo-spiritual journey. I travel extensively, not as much as I would like to, but as much as spirit allowed me, right? I didn't have funding. There were no grants. There were no advances from a publisher or private patrons, but instead a lot of sacrifices that I made. And occasionally there was the act of mercy that the ancestors would bestow upon me. Acts of mercy that would come in the form of my friend Sylvia, who would call me telling me, "Iha, did you check your bank account?" And I'm thinking, uh-oh, identity theft. But no, what she did was to take it upon herself to send me what I would refer to as a winter solstice gift, right? So Sylvia, gracias, mi hermana, for that. I had other friends, like my late friend, Martin Okeke, who made certain I got to France when an organization who invited me to an event was denied funding. So he paid for my plane there. And Martin, wherever you are, Ibaye, I say thank you, Modupwe. My friends, Erasmo Lara and Darrell Beekman, and I referred to Iman earlier, who, knowing that I would either be traveling with them or in the countries that they live in, they were, of course, aware of my interests. But more importantly, they made sure that even though it wasn't financial support, it was extremely important support that they provided, giving me access to tour guides or a chauffeur that would allow me to go to the places I needed to see. And without that kind of support, I would have missed places like the memorial to the abolition of slavery in Nantes, the Ingenio de Bocanigua in the Dominican Republic, the slavery memorials of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the Sally Bassett Memorial in Gibbets Island in Bermuda. And one of them, Gibbets Island, has a particularly insidious history that had just been unveiled. So, you know, thank you to those. And as I'm a priest, you know, I have to understand when spirit speaks to me. So I knew that Legba, Papa Legba, was taking me on a path of earth, of air, of fire and water. And I'm going to share these images of sites relative to these spaces with you shortly. But let me also say that because we do talk about, and we're examining monuments and memorials in the book, it means that we talk about death, right? You can't talk about monuments and memorials without talking about death and the politics of death. Things like in Bermuda, where there's a segregated cemetery. On one side are the colored and free and enslaved Blacks. On the other side is the white cemetery. Now, there's a wall separating them. Apparently, the people who are lighter skinned were placed closer to the wall because on the other side of the wall were the white folks. Segregation in the necropolis, that's some funky stuff, you know? But these are some of the things that I learned on this journey. Now, I know talking about death sounds morbid, and besides my goddaughter, Tracy, who, you know, shares the fascination for the morbid, other people may not, but I don't want you to get depressed. You know, what I tried to do in this work was to take some really beautiful photographs, some, I hope, striking photos, because I do believe that if our ancestors did not see some sign of hope, if they didn't see some semblance of beauty in an otherwise wretched and horrifying existence, that no members of the descendant community would be standing in the Americas. You know, we just wouldn't be here. So I'm going to make just a few more points before we go to the images. Actually, they're final points. What I learned in the course of this pilgrimage that I made, among the things, is that we don't even have language to accurately describe the truth of our journey. The Ma'afa it lasted centuries. There were over 100 million Africans who perished in the process. And clearly not all their stories could be told. But there were also things that kept happening over and over and over again. And And there were no words to describe not only the feelings, but also certain phenomena that kept repeating themselves over and over again. And they gnawed away at me, forcing me to enter spaces that I didn't want. For example, I created the word lieu de désonner to talk about spaces that were created, they were ritualized spaces to help us, to make us forget who we were, forget our names, forget those we loved, forget the countries that we came from, the communities that were central to defining who we were. There's no word, there were no words in the kind of text that I read to help describe that phenomena. I always thought about philosophers as being the apex predators of the academic food chain. So I had to go to Hegel, I had to go to Lefebvre, to Habermas, to Edward Soja and Pierre Nora, whilst uplifting the works of Joseph Ajayi, Michel Trouot, Francis Cress Wells, Marimba, Ani Ali, Amy Césaire, people who are members of the Academy who read this book. You're the ones who's going to have to tell me if I did right, if I understood and engaged in the argument sufficiently. But it was important for me not just to talk about and engage, as I did my research, the works of white philosophers and white male philosophers, but I also made a point of pulling forward the work of African and Caribbean philosophers, not just men, but women thought leaders as well. And lastly, a number of the scholars that I reference are in fact very much concerned about the issue of geography. So social space, spatialization, postmodern human geography are central to my thoughts. So now let's go to the videotape. Let's go to the PowerPoint presentation and take a look at some of the places that I visited, and we'll talk about that for a few minutes. Tracy. Okay, my geo-spiritual journey had me walking in the footsteps of my ancestors, of the ancestors. And sometimes I climbed high places. When I was at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., I scaled a 60-foot ladder to get to a scaffolding that would allow me to take pictures of 2 African faces that were on the side of the cathedral. I was so glad I had been walking all summer and burned some of that fat off my hips, because I would have never made it up the hill. On the other side, we see me in a graveyard. And I visited this graveyard before in 2010, but I went back in 2018 to shoot one of my favorite headstones. This happens to be Maria Stowe. And you see her headstone is now leaning against the palm trees there. Why is it leaning? Because hurricanes came through, destroyed a lot of places in the island, and the cemetery was one of the places affected. Next slide. Next slide, please. I spoke of Legba's path. Now, Baba Legba is that divine force in the Afro-Atlantic world who speaks to transformations. He is the spiritual guardian of crossroads, the owner of the plane, the dweller at the door. Legba represents the portals that we enter, and when we make transformation, and who we go to when we want to speak to the ancestors, to the other Loi, when we speak to divine. And I understood that, especially, I didn't realize it then. I realized it after I looked at my photographs, that I was taking the same image over and over again. And so we have one image of me on the route to an unknown journey, a path of earth in Nigeria. We have a path to the right of the Citadelle La Ferrière, a path that was a fire, of course, the path of freedom that Africans made from themselves in Haiti. The next slide will show us paths of air and water. So we have the path of freshly fallen snow in Nova Scotia. And this is a path that was beaten out by the feet of Africans who, having fought on the side of the British, during the American Revolutionary War. Of course, we know how that story ended. The Americans won, but these Africans fought on the side of the British because they were promised their freedom. And so they marched from as far south as Chesapeake Bay, Virginia. Imagine that, all the way up to Nova Scotia for freedom. So that was the path of air. The other path of water is the Petit Hollande. These buildings that you see, this alleyway, was built by Africans who, having been deported to France, were part of one of the, well, Nantes in France was actually the largest slave trading port in continental Europe. And so that was the path of water. The next slide. Now you all know what this is, and you know I'm proud, big time, of the Citadelle La Ferrière. It took over 23,000 Africans to build this following independence. And on one hand, it is a sign of like, I am not gonna let you people come back and enslave us again. You know, that's just not gonna happen. And so we basically carved a fortress out of a mountain. And each one of these small stones, these little bricks, they've been there for over 200 years. They haven't budged because the cement, the stuff is so tight, right? It is we who created the cement that has kept this fortress standing strong. And so for me, you know, everybody Black, everybody who considers himself of African descent needs to go to the Citadel. This is Ogun's place. This is Shango's place. This is a place about audacity. This is a place about you are not going to catch us no more. And if you think you're coming from us, we have a cannon literally with your name on it. Next slide. This is Place Adjossi in Benin. You know, I went to this place many years ago and I traveled, I don't know, we're driving like 4 hours to get to this place. And I get there and we're walking around and I'm like, where, after 45 minutes, I'm like, where's this monument that we came to see? And they said, you're walking on it. I said, what do you mean I'm walking on it? And they told me that every single one of these pebbles, every single one of these rocks, these wash that you see, they represent the head of an African who had gone missing, who was killed, who was kidnapped, who was injured and otherwise unaccounted for during the internecine wars in Africa. Africans themselves were engaged in battle about who was going to continue the slave trade and who was not. And initially, these, you know, the urgency of this monument was like, who's gone? They were just throwing stones down so we can keep track. Our ancestors were able to keep track of people. The monument was flat, it was level on the ground, but now there's a school there. And so they heaped everything up and created this mound of all of these, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, if not more, stones. So again, wash, casse, wash. Next slide. This is in the Dominican Republic, but at the time it was just Hispaniola, right? And I gotta give a special shout out to Erasmo Lara, former ambassador of the Dominican Republic, who was the first ambassador of African descent to at least admit he was of African descent at the UN, and to his daughter, Ana, because it was Ana who told me that we weren't far from this place. And this place is the Ingenio de Bocanigua. It is the sugar mill that was owned by Christopher Columbus's son, Diego. It is the first site of insurrection in the Americas in 1521. So over 40 Senegambians burnt this place to the ground. And it is an unmarked place in San Cristobal in the Dominican Republic. But it is the first place that we revolted against enslavement in the Americas. And so those burnt and charred stones made me happy. They made me proud. Next slide, please. These huge, they're boulders. This is in Guyana, in the city of Georgetown. And I don't know for how many miles they go on, but these huge rocks were moved by Africans from the land to the seashore, forced to do so by the Dutch colonizers to create a sea wall. This speaks so much to the strength and endurance of our people, but also tells you how instrumental Africans were to building the infrastructure of cities. So as I said, the rocks were everywhere. Next slide. Liverpool, England, and Savannah, Georgia. Now, this slide, these two images were upsetting for a number of reasons. One is because the image of the two young Africans, those children, they are holding various pots, or actually they look like bags of money. And the webbed hands are that of Neptune. This is a low relief sculpture that is found on the side door of, the side of a bank in Liverpool, a bank that specifically financed slave ships that were taking Africans from the slave coast to Europe and onto the Americas. So if you didn't know where you can get money to get your insurance and loans for your slave ship, you were able to go to Martin's Bank because it was literally, the handwriting was on the wall. On the other side are stones that were ballasts. Ballasts are stones that are put in a ship, and in this case specifically a slave ship, so that it would keep the boats balanced. And it kept the boat, keep slave ships afloat, so that the human cargo and whatever other cargo that they had would continue to stay up as goods were unloaded. Now, these stones, these rocks left the bowels of the slave ships. Africans had to take them and then create a road. This is part of a road that then took them to fattening houses in Savannah that were places where our people were cleaned up and purified so they could be sold into further bondage. And the idea of this just gets under my nerves. Next slide. In Bermuda, and this I got to give thanks to Iman. The island that you see on the side looks like a beautiful little place, right? Great little vacation spot. No, Gibbets Island, it had just been discovered maybe a month before I visited this venue had been a place where Africans were gibbeted. You know, they were placed on the equivalent of crucifixes. Their bodies were left after they had been tortured and mangled. They were left there to die in open air, so that as ships coming in with fresh arrivals with new Africans, they would see the dying Africans on that island. They would see them being tormented. They would see them dying. They would smell their flesh being putrefied. They would see their skeletal remains. That island was used to intimidate incoming Africans, so that they knew, if you try to escape, if you try to leave, if you try to revolt, this is what's going to happen to you. Now, one of the Africans who may have seen this, but apparently didn't give a damn, was Sister Sally Bassett, who promptly poisoned her owners and their children. And she was, of course, burned at the stake. And this monument is of her. There are a number of extraordinarily brave historic women that we're just getting around to recognizing and commemorating in the built and public environment. So she was bound and burned alive for her act of resistance. Next slide. Watery Graves. You know, in Igbo Landing, we had a mass suicide of over 75 Africans, Igbos, who, when they realized that they had been bought into bondage, decided, oh no, we would rather die, and we will go back home to Africa, to Guinea, beneath the waters. And so they, men, women, children, went into those waters and purposely drowned themselves. I had access to this place thanks to the owners of the property there. Happened to be a white guy, but he was good enough to allow me to come onto his property in his home and take these photos. On the other side, we had the Cotilda, the site of the arson. The Cotilda was believed to be the last recorded slave ship that left the port of Ouidah and in Benin and arrived in the Americas. It was just discovered last year that the remains of the Cotilda in the Mobile River, they had just been found, and the captain, Ben Rames, was kind enough to take me on his boat and take me to the site. And if I wasn't on top of where that ship was, then I was just a few feet away from it, and I give thanks to him for that. Next. In Nantes, and again, Martin Okeke Ibaye, and thank you. Because of the support of this friend, I was able to go to Nantes in France and see, flanking the centerpiece is the memorial for the abolition of slavery. And in the middle, we have an image carved out of an African on the side of the building, owned by slave traders. That alleyway that I showed you earlier, that I talked about, Legba's path of water, one of the buildings has her face, and several of the buildings have faces of Africans carved into them. And it was a way of letting people know, this is how I made my money. I'm a slave trader. And what? So our stories, right? What we remember, how we are commemorated, are oftentimes not even being told by us, right? They're being told by other people, and a lot of times our own historic oppressors. One of the issues with the memorial to the abolition of slavery, the images on the extreme left and the extreme right, is that it talks about the abolition of slavery without ever talking about why there was enslavement to begin with. Why do you need to abolish something? Why do you want to create a memorial to the abolishment of something when you don't even want to acknowledge that it existed to begin with? So this site is controversial, but that's the same time, it's an important site, and I encourage anybody who has a chance to go to visit. Next slide. Beryl Beekman, Dr. Beekman, thank you so much, is my sister from Suriname who enabled me to, she got me like a Mercedes-Benz limousine. And so I rolled up in style in Rotterdam and in Amsterdam to these memorials. And this particular one is called clave. And the clave is that actual brown, that rust metal piece that is, again, something that we find in slave ships. But the clave is also that rhythm that we know so well in Afro-Cuban music, that rhythm that also came from West Africa. And I used to wonder, why on earth are these people dancing? They're supposed to be enslaved Africans, but the clave from a spiritual perspective is also the key to unleashing spirit within us. And so these are some like little tidbits that I bring up in my book as well. Next slide, I think is a detail of one of these images. So again, like I said, I tried to take some interesting photographs so that while we're talking about something that is painful for you, the viewer, for you, the reader, I want you to find some, something that's like, oh, wow, this is breathtaking. I can understand why she went on this journey. Next slide. There were doors of no return. We see one on the left in Benin and the other one in Senegal. The one in Ouida was a virtual door of no return. If you hear me say port is door, a virtual door of no return on a beach where millions of Africans said goodbye to the African soil for the last time. But this door, the first time I went to Benin, it wasn't even there. It was created in like 1994. And so I went through the door and I went back in again, because for me, it was, while it may have been called the door of no return, it was the door of return for me. And it has since become the door of return for thousands of people who have gone back to Benin. The other door is actually ajar. It is the door of no return that most people know from Senegal. And so I took that shot. I thought it was an interesting contrast, both architecturally, but in terms of lightness and darkness, as above, so below for you to look at. Normally, this door, you would be able to look right into the sea, and there were rocks just below. So again, the wash come up. There were rocks just below. The first and second times I went to Senegal to see, but the time I went, the third time, last year, the year before, it's not a balcony, but a kind of little balcony, that yellow line that you see, that yellow wall that you see at the bottom had been created. So sites also change a bit. But you feel the energy of our ancestors when you go to these places. I think I just have a couple of more, right? Next slide. This is a little bit of a joke in the sense of evoking the little house with the white picket fence, only this little house is a slave house. A slave or shack for the enslaved, and a little picket fence around them. This structure was funded by John Cummings of the Whitney Plantation, the first. No, I shouldn't say the first. It is actually the second, but it is the best known and best financed slave museum in the United States, and this is in Louisiana. I was very much touched by this, and as difficult and painful as the story is of those who live there, the ancestors who live there. Again, for me, there's a beauty to this space, and the fact that, no matter where we are, regardless of the conditions, we try to create home and always make sure that our identity and sense of humanity remains intact. Next image, and that might be the last if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Again, I talked about memorials and monuments to the slave trade. I showed you some images of doors of no return. Well, this is the Arc de Retour. My fellow countryman, my compatriot, Rodney Leon, was selected. He was commissioned by the United Nations to create this monument to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, and so you can go to the United Nations in New York and find it on the plaza, prominently placed there. So the Durban Declaration and the activities that came out of the Durban process, including this International Decade for People of African Descent, it's the work of activists, the activists that I worked with, my own laborers and others, that enabled the creation of this particular memorial. So if there's nothing anywhere else, we at least have this, but the hope is that there will be many more memorials for us to visit and to find respite, to find a place where we can commune with our ancestors. Okay, we can come back to the full screen, and people have questions. We can begin our Q&A.
Please place your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out to the Queen Mother, and she will answer all of your burning questions. I have to ask, in the meantime, while people are documenting their questions, Queen Mother, can you share with us what motivated you in the very beginning to start this work? And I'm talking about, did you get a message in prayer? How did you decide to embark on this journey?
I decided to embark on this journey. I don't know if I made the decision as much as I had realized a long time ago that I was doing work as a curator on public space, public art, and that a lot of times they were involving dead people. Mm-hmm. And, I was the executive director of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center at the Audubon Ballroom, where Brother Malcolm was actually assassinated. I worked with a number of the African burial ground where over 500 remains of Africans were interred. And so I knew within myself, but also a Lukumi priest had said to me that I'm very close to the dead, and that they work with me, they work through me, and when I found myself being able to travel extensively, I realized that okay, there's a reason why this is happening, and took my camera and just made it my business of shooting anything, everything that spoke to our experiences during the Ma'afa. And let me say something, because I see something over here. The brother or sister, Jackie, who talks about Sister Esther Stanford Shosi, a reparations activist in London. She refers to the Ma'afa as the Manganezi. And yes, that term, equally important. It speaks to the same kind of experience. Jackie, let me say to you that I think whoever's writing the scholarship on one side of the Atlantic tends to use one language. Who's ever writing the scholarship on the other side of the Atlantic uses another language. But both of them speak to the intentionality of destroying the African person, of destroying our culture, our memory. They both words speak to that. They're both Bantu Congo words. So I want you to understand that. And let me point out something else that's going on here. The word Ma'afa was brought up by a sister, all right? And I made reference to her earlier. Miriamba Ani Ali, she's the one who wrote that. who put that out there in the early 70s. Brother Karenga came up with the term mangamezi, which again is equally relevant. But I take issue when men scholars kind of override and try to undo the work that our women, that our sisters have done. All right. So there's a politics to the use of language here that it's important that we be cognizant of. And I've had this conversation already with Sister Esther. So she knows where I'm coming from. I know where she's coming from. But let me say, Mangamezi, Ma'afa, again, they speak to the incredible suffering and the destruction of the African person and his or her culture. And it is the realization and the understanding of that. As a priest, as a voodoo priest, my sister, and I'm talking to you directly, Tracy, the songs, the prayers that I sing, you know, the prayers that call on the names of all of these heads that perished, I knew this wasn't an accident. It was like the song, the prayer, the Priya Jo, the Priya Guinée, that was a roadmap. That was telling me, so-and-so did this. We came from here. We did that. And so I needed to go to those places when I realized, like Badagry, we talk about Ogun, Badagry. Badagry is an actual place in Nigeria, right? It is an actual place. It is a port city, and the slave trade was there. So why was Ogun Badagry? Why was he named or identified from that place? So it's those elements of both intellectual and spiritual curiosity that propelled me to go to these places.
Thank you.
And document.
We have a number of additional questions, and I'll just insert very quickly that Marimba Ani, the elder that the Queen Mother spoke of, you'll recognize her as the author of both Yurugu and Let the Circle Be Unbroken, which are books that a lot of people know. So Melvi asks, the place where the white gentleman let you on his property, did he ever mention that he felt something or even heard sounds during his time there on the property?
Yes, he did. He did. He did talk about how there were times when he could hear voices. He could hear voices. I'm just looking through my book because I do want to acknowledge him. Yes, Tommy Pickren. So Tommy, wherever you are, thank you. Yes, he did do that. And he took it upon himself, actually, to create a sign that said Igbo landing on his property. He spelled it EBO, I believe, as opposed to IGBO, but there's different ways of spelling Igbo. But he took it upon himself to mark that spot because the state had not.
Ashe. Thank you. All right, we have a number of questions. Iasushil Bibbs, I'm sorry, Karen Stowe Stiles asks, who is Maria Stowe and what was her significance? And she says she may be my ancestor.
But wait, really?
Karen Stowe Stiles.
Oh, wow. Well, let me look through my book, the first book, to see if I can, that would be incredible. That would be incredible. She, again, okay, I'm going to show you this picture, right? And you see how beautiful the headstone is. It was Maria Elizabeth Stowe is her full name, an African descendant, born 1822, 1842. And her marker, I just found exceptional because it was so intact, and it was, you know, it was clear that she was loved and she mattered to whoever interred her. This is in Bermuda. And again, you can find this marker at the graveyard for slave and free blacks in Bermuda. It is, by the way, UNESCO. It's part of the UNESCO slave routes, and I believe is now also been given status as a World Heritage Site. So let me know Let me know if you're related.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, Sushil Bibbs says, I just want to say, yeah, Queen Mother, what an important historical and work of art this is. Thank you. I'll read it and recommend it. It is so valuable.
Thank you.
And we have another question from Miss Tassie Long. Um, she asks, what is the name of the woman whose statue is in Bermuda?
Oh, that's Sally Bassett. Or
Sally Bassett.
Bassett, Bassett.
Thank you. Okay, so Jackie says, I don't have a question, but put forth a huge congratulations to the Queen Mother for what is a fascinating project slash book. I was fascinated by those images and would really like to see these again. And we will, in a moment, have a slide up that shows you where you can buy the book. There's also a link in the on the Eventbrite page, so know that you can have all of these beautiful photos for yourself when you purchase the book.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you. And I hope, I mean, I have printed a number of these images, and I hope to make them available to those who wish. I printed them out and matted and framed them because I'm supposed to have exhibitions here in the Mid-Hudson Valley, in Haiti, in California, but the COVID virus has, you know, altered things and postponed things, but stay posted. Let me
we
know
have
if you're really interested in something.
Oh, perfect. And your email address is also in the Eventbrite message. A couple more questions I want to make sure we get. Mama Badarinwa asks, is there a ritual place in Benin for visiting Africans coming from America to the door of no return?
Is there a ritual?
In place in Benin for visiting Africans coming from America at the door of no return?
No. At each of the places that I've been to, and since that I have been in partnership, I have made it a point, and we have made it a point to conduct various rituals wherever we go. I have to say that there were rituals historically that took place to encourage Africans to return, but they were done clandestinely. They were done in secret in Benin. With the tours that I'll be organizing, a Sacred Knowledges tour, part of what my intention is to have a kind of set ritual for people to participate in when they arrive. Although the simplest thing any of us can do on our own is, you know, what you saw me doing. Have water and pour libations at the spot. Wherever you are, in front of the church, at the door of no return. That's the simplest thing to do, but the plan is to have something organized and more specific that everybody can be taught to do if they wish when they are at such sites. So thank you.
Thank you. So Melvi asks, how do you spell the word that the four images were standing on, the clave?
Oh, CLAVE. And the clave, I wish I had some. I bought a beautiful pair of claves, gave them to my ex-husband. I don't know why, but they're small sticks, you know, very finely smooth, and you bang them, da 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 da, and that helps maintain the rhythm in any dance environment, both ritual and sacred,
Thank you.
and secular rather.
We have one more question for you. Sean asks, can you speak to the recent open letter to the UN signed by all African nations for them to take action on racism? That's a lot of nerve. How do you think that it will affect their inaction on the DDPA?
First of all, I'm surprised to hear that. I guess I've been so deeply involved in a bunch of other things that that African nations ask that. Will it make a difference? I only hope so. I only hope so. You know, why did it take the African countries this long to petition member states to do this? Why did it take all these killings and these burnings and these demonstrations? Why did it take all this rage to get the global community at large to pay attention to this cause? You know, quietly behind the scenes, and sometimes not so quietly. There have been activists and NGOs who have been lobbying and meeting in places like Brazil, in Nigeria, in Geneva, to negotiate to have the DDPA or elements of the DDPA implemented so that the disposition of African descendants changes dramatically, that the structural racism, the environmental racism, the disparities in housing, the technological divide, the digital divide that we have, all of these things change. It's only a 256-page booklet that spells out what should be done the day after the demonstrations, or and being on the streets. What should be done and how it might be done. Everybody's paid attention to that. And so for me, we can write all the letters we want, we can have all the documents that we want, but it's not going to mean anything until specific action is taken. And in the diplomatic community, those actions mean everything from shaming member states into doing something, and or having sanctions against them. Sanctions, and renegotiating the terms by which business is conducted. You know, as long as you continue killing and murdering African descendants in the United States, members of the African diaspora in Europe, in Asia, you're not getting none of our stuff. You're not getting our coltan. You're not getting our gold. You're not getting our cacao. You're not getting our cement. You're not getting our gold. You're not getting our diamonds. That's what means something to the global North. Not letters and papers. Those are certainly important things. Those are important things, and we have to have these things in place. We need these documents, legal documents in place, but it's also action. It seems to be the only thing that our member states get, our governments get. It's action. And so until African states, civil society is already doing what it's got to do, right? But until the African states lay the law of the land down and say that there were going to be specific consequences for the continued actions of governments who are indifferent to the plight of African descendants, who enforce invisibility is one of the terms I made up. Through their action or inaction, keep us invisible, keep us under the radar, keep inequalities and inequity in place. Until those things are altered, it's not going to mean anything. And the only thing the powerful governments understand is money, is money. So the trade agreements need to be renegotiated. Access to resources needs to be renegotiated. The ability to buy land, all of that has to be renegotiated. That's all. That's all that's going to change things at the end of the day. And also, it's one thing to have resources, but you also need something. You need an army, you need a navy, you need armed forces to be able to defend what is yours. And that is an issue that we have throughout the continent, that there are not enough resources or personnel to protect our assets. And that allows people to come in and loot and use and denigrate whatever possibility for economic dignity and development that Africans and African descendant people can have. you know.
Thank you. One last question, and it's a perfect question to close on before we share a little bit more information about getting your book. Um, it comes from Regine Romain, and she says, I say honor and respect to you, Queen Mother. What is
Yeah.
next for the Queen Mother? Where is she speaking next, or where are you speaking next? And when are your tours happening?
Okay. What's next is sort of to get back on track. All of the things that were supposed to happen, the book tours, the discussions, the presentations that were to have been made. I hope to be able to go back to the West Coast, go back to Texas, to Trinidad, to a number of places, so I can have these discussions one-on-one with people, have my exhibitions. That's a part of it. Another part of it is to, I'll be setting up classes online for those who are seriously interested in the book. I confess it, you know, while I want everybody to know it, it's not light reading. As my son said, this is a book you need to take your time with. Because there are, as I stated earlier, there are sometimes multiple meanings to what I say. So I'll be creating a series of classes that will allow those who purchase the book to sign up. If they're not free, they'll be at a very, very low cost to those who actually purchase the book. And so you can follow me and we'll go through the text and understand some of the critical points that I do raise, issues about public space, about what does privacy mean, the idea of Afro mnemonics, which is how do Black people, how do we as African descendants choose to remember things, Afro-humanism, again, as I said, there were a number of words, ideas that I had to invent because the language just wasn't there. And I did a fairly rigorous amount of research as I was writing the book. So those are among the things that I'll be doing. So you'll be able to go online, and we'll be sure to let you know when those classes are available. In terms of concrete things, next week, Sirens of the Rainforest, I'm the chairperson of that organization. We're doing a gala on Juneteenth. That will be online, so you'll be able to see me there. And the tours, the Sacredologies tours that were supposed to take place in Benin would have gotten launched this summer. But you know what's affecting everybody and everything everywhere. We're going to wait, and it will probably be next summer that we will have this tour where you're going to spend several days, 4 elements, 4 voodoo, and 4 principal cities, where we learn the prayers, the songs, the panegyrics of voodoo, of earth, of air, of fire, of water. It is intended to be a kind of mini seminary course because the long-term plan is to create a seminary itself. So the AfroAtlantic Theologies and Treaties Institute is going to transform itself into a seminary for Afro-Atlantic theologies, faiths, spiritual practice, and have the same kind of rigor the actual seminaries have for Christians. We need to know what our canon is. We need to be able to understand each other. We need to understand what the differences are, if there are any differences between Vodou and Lukumi and Paulo. There's so much writing that has been done, and increasingly film and music. Like Chaka and Kidana have done like wonderful work around a music video, rap, that speaks to African spirituality. There's a lot, Nana Shula, there's a bunch of people who have done that. Baba John Mason, who's done orchestral music, Wole Alade, who are transforming the sort of fundamentals of our music Ibeji, there's tons of them, who are redefining the energy and the spirit of our music, reinfusing it with another kind of power for another generation of people. That we want to be able to bring some of those folks to Benin, so that we understand what voodoo looks like in the 21st century. That's my big objective, my big.
And we sincerely appreciate just how well-rounded you are. One of the projects that people don't necessarily know a lot about is the school in Ouida. So if you could talk a little bit about the school and your sustainable energy work.
Thank you. Yes, I think Aisha wants to come out because this how he keeps wanting to lean one way or the other. But yes, one of the things that we are doing is, well, Dada's father had founded the Voodoo Wedo School in Ouida 25 years ago. And the school is intended to provide an education, formal education, to young people, primary school age, who would otherwise not have a chance to be educated. You know, a lot of times in our communities, young people who are designated as voodooisants, who are there to serve the loi, there to serve spirit, all they do is focus on that. And so they don't have a chance to learn the 3 R's. And one of the things that I am making a personal mission and mandate as Queen Mother is to raise money for the school. It's 25 years old, and it is literally falling apart around these young people. And I want to make sure that they don't get left behind, that they're not learning in the dark. So renewable energy, getting solar panels, panel generators that would allow lighting and eventually secure tablets for the schools, because again, there is a digital divide. And these kids are so determined. They are so determined to learn. They walk literally miles, sometimes twice a day. But you know, for me, what seemed like 5 kilometers back and forth to school, in whatever the weather conditions are. They have their little blackboards and they're writing away, they're studying, they're doing their work. How many of us would bother to go to school if those are the conditions that we had to endure? A lot of people wouldn't, but these young people are determined, and I am determined to help them. And we will be launching a GoFundMe to help me raise the money that I need to purchase their Firefly renewable energy solar panel generators that will allow us to provide electricity to the schools, for the students, for the teachers, for the administrators, and eventually get those students these generators in their homes, because you can't do your homework in the dark, right? So by the end of the summer, be on the lookout for that. We'll be presenting the generators, and hopefully we'll have knapsacks and filled with pencils and notebooks, rulers and such, as well as tablets to give our young students. There's 100 of them in Ouida by January 10th. Well, that's definitely one place to see me. January 10th in Ouida in 2021. I'll also be marking the first anniversary of my consecration as Her Majesty Queen Mother, the Pojito at the Royal Palace of Dada Dagbo Huna Huna.
Give thanks. So there is a question about how they can find out information about your sustainable energy project, and I will share with everyone that the Queen Mother is revamping her website. So she has so many projects and she's so busy doing that we are making sure that she captures everything in a place where everybody can see everything that's going on. And believe me, that is a lot. But I have placed the links to a couple of her sites in the chat. So you are welcome to copy those and paste them into your own documents so that you can review them later. I'm also going to share a screen, share the image of the slide that reminds you that you can get the book Redlining a Holocaust, Memorials and the People of the Afro-Atlantic at lulu.com. The book is on sale currently, as well as her previous book, Good Kasi Good, and you can buy them both on the site. So Queen Mother, there were a number of beautiful platitudes left in the chat that I will that I will leave for you to read a little later.
Yes.
And a further appreciation, everyone, of the work of the Queen Mother is supporting her work by buying her books. And also, if you are a teacher, we have a lot of professors and even students who are here on the call today. If you please recommend her book for the curriculums in your schools, and consider starting a study group in your area to review her text and actually discuss her work with others, so that the reach of the work of the Queen Mother can continue to grow.
And to that end, thank you so much for that, Tracy. I am available both online and when things normalize, whatever that will mean. So long as I'm here in the States, we'll happily come to your campuses as well. I enjoy traveling, obviously, but I also want to make a point of capturing additional sites where that is available. Because one of the things I've tried to do, I put out Good Kasi Good, Country, Memory, and Spaces of the Afro-Atlantic to launch the International Decade for People of African Descent privately. The Redlining a Holocaust, Memorials and the People of the Afro-Atlantic was deliberately published now as part of a mid-year review of the decade. And then there'll be, I don't know, another book or another edition of the current book in 2024. So these three texts will at least be a marker to commemorate this important period in our history, in our era. You know, the Chinese would say that it could be a curse to be born in interesting times. Well, we're certainly in interesting times, but let it not be a curse for us. Let it be a way of empowering us and strengthening us and enabling us to create solidarity amongst our various communities. Solidarity not only across the culture of you know, the US versus the Caribbean versus continental Africa versus Europe or Africans in Asia, but also the cultures between contemporary life and traditional life, the traditional sector. We tend not to think about those communities as well. And none of us will be able to move forward if a space isn't created for all of us to move forward.
So the last thing I'll share with everybody is that the Queen Mother is also available for booking. So she has been doing a number of speaking tours all over the country, all over the world, and she's still doing virtual presentations. So if you would like to book the Queen Mother, her email address is here, devotedesir@gmail.com, and you can talk to her about bringing her to your space virtually. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I think we can give the Queen Mother a round of applause. Thank you for your time, and we will look forward to your next presentation. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tracy. You are a light and a joy and a delight to work with. And everyone, my friends, in particular, family, but all of you who are my supporters who have made it a point of spending your afternoon with me. You have my gratitude. I look forward to seeing you again. Ayi bobo.
Ayi bobo.